I'm Nate and this is Holy Land Travel HQ. Today, let's talk about the Via Dolorosa. Every year, millions of Christians head to the Holy Land to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. One of the many attractions that they will experience is the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of the Cross. But what is the Via Dolorosa? Latin for the sorrowful way or the painful path, the Via Dolorosa is the traditional route that Jesus carried his cross from where he was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate to Calvary. It consists of 14 stations that commemorate different events that happened along the way. Today, the Via Dolorosa starts near the Lion's Gate at the Filmora school, which sits on the spot where scholars think the Antonia Fortress once stood, and it ends at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which houses both the Mount of Calvary, otherwise known as Golgotha, and the tomb of Christ itself. If your group takes part in one of these processions, walking the Via Dolorosa can take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half. It all depends on how long your tour guide spends at each station. If you walk it on your own, without stopping or dealing with any pedestrian traffic, it can take about 15 to 20 minutes. The procession hasn't always started at the Filmora school and ended at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre though, nor has it always been the same route. Even more surprising is how the route was established in the first place. In the Gospel of Mark, we get the most dramatic and descriptive commentary on Jesus' path to the cross. Mark was writing to Gentile Christians living in Rome, which meant they grew up in and saw life through Roman society and traditions. Many scholars have noted that Mark's description of Christ's crucifixion procession is modeled after the Roman triumphal march that celebrated a victorious general or emperor. As a result, the importance of the Via Dolorosa procession is that it celebrates Christ's sacrifice and triumph on the cross. Originally, the Roman triumphal march proclaimed victory for a military conquest. The general's soldiers would declare him a victorious general imperator, and the Senate would decree a triumph. The general would take the title of triumphator and then appear in the triumphal robe, which was purple in color, wearing a laurel crown on his head and holding a branch. Sometimes the robe is described as scarlet though. Before the march began, the general would meet his troops to receive their praise. In the Gospel of Mark, Christ is given a makeshift purple robe and a crown of thorns. Then the Roman soldiers mock Jesus by jokingly saluting him and calling him the King of the Jews. This is all similar but opposite in meaning to the praise a triumphator receives, and the wooden cross is a replacement for the branch. Over time, the Roman triumph became the exclusive right of the Roman emperor, and by the time of Jesus, several other aspects have been added to it. As the triumphator marched into the Forum on the Sacra Via, a sacrificial bull would accompany him. The bull would be dressed in a purple robe and crowned in order to signify its identity with the triumphator. Next to the bull was its executioner, carrying the method of execution, a double-bladed axe. Though Simon of Cyrene is mentioned in the other Gospels, in Mark's Gospel, the similarity to the bull and the executioner is clear. Jesus is both the triumphator and the sacrifice, and Simon stood in for the executioner as he walked with Jesus carrying the method of execution. When the triumphator reached the Forum, he was offered a cup of wine, but he would refuse it. Instead, he would pour it out on the altar or the bull itself to signify the blood that was about to be spilled. In the Roman triumphal march, the significance of the bull was that of a god, and its sacrifice was the god's death to show the magnificence of the triumphator. In the case of Jesus, like the triumphator, when he was offered the wine, he refused. The Via Dolorosa is not mentioned in the Bible. This is because it is a Christian tradition that was developed over time, rather than something that was gleaned from the Gospels, much like communion was. In the Gospels, the crucifixion narrative is told in Matthew 27, Luke 15, Mark 23, and John 18 and 19. Matthew mentions the mocking from the soldiers, but he says little to nothing about the journey from the praetorium to the cross. He says, "As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross." Matthew 27:32. Luke does not mention the mocking from the soldiers at the praetorium, but his description of the journey is similar to Matthew's with a couple additions. He includes a large crowd that mourned for Jesus, and he notes Jesus' interaction with the women of Jerusalem on his way to Calvary. Luke writes, "As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?'" Luke 23:26-31. John quickly describes the beating and mocking of Jesus, but it happens before Jesus is sentenced, and his description of the journey is only 2 sentences long. He states, "So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha." John 19:17. Mark, on the other hand, spends 4 verses describing how the soldiers mocked Jesus, and the mocking happens after he is sentenced. This is important because of how the Roman triumphal march is described, which has the general soldiers praising him after the Senate vote but before the march. Mark specifically describes the soldiers falling on their knees to pay homage to Jesus in a mocking way. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. There are many ways that the crucifixion narrative is similar to the Roman triumphal march to begin with. All the Gospels tell the same story. The only thing that Mark did was tell it through the triumphal march because of who his audience was. Mark also describes who Simon of Cyrene was. Though Simon is referred to in the other Gospels, and his presence was certainly to suggest the wearing down of the procession on Jesus, Mark's use of the event is consistent with the Roman triumphal march. Jesus is a sacrifice, and walking next to him is an official who carries the instrument of the sacrifice's death. Mark is the only one who mentions Simon of Cyrene's connection to the community of believers. His sons are Alexander and Rufus, who the Roman Christians most likely knew. This would place Simon in a higher status than just a mere passerby, someone who is divinely appointed for the purposes of the triumphal march. When Jesus reaches Golgotha, he is offered wine mixed with myrrh, whereas in the other accounts it is described as wine vinegar and offered while he is on the cross. In the triumphal march, the triumphator is offered wine at the end of the march before the sacrifice is made. The Roman triumphal march ends at the Capitolium, where the temple of Jupiter was. The Capitolium was on Capitoline Hill, which got its name because during the laying of the foundation of the temple, a human head was found with its features intact. It was thus proclaimed that the location was the head or capita of all Italy. Like John, Mark also states that Golgotha means place of the skull, but in Mark's case, he's specifically tying it to Capitoline Hill. All of this is pertinent because of where the Via Dolorosa that we know today was developed. Though the path of Jesus' triumphal march is not mentioned in the Bible, we do have the names of the start and finish. We know that it started at the palace or praetorium, where Pilate stayed, and we know it ended at Golgotha, or the place of the skull. In the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, while the Roman Empire entered its late stages, Christians knew where these locations were, and often visited them to pay homage to Christ's sacrifice. There's even a legend that Mary, the mother of Jesus, would walk the route every day until her death. Even after Hadrian renamed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina in 130 AD and built a temple to Venus, the Roman goddess of love, over the site of Golgotha, Christians still continued to pass down knowledge of these locations to their offspring. And the fact that the temple of Venus sat over the spot, known to be Golgotha, simply made it a marker for future generations. In the 4th century, when Constantine established Christianity as the religion of the state, what had been practiced in solemn silence under the Romans became outward expressions of faith. On Holy Thursday, Christians would assemble on the Mount of Olives at the Eleona Church to commemorate the Last Supper. Today, this site is known as the Mosque of the Ascension of Jesus. Christians would then walk down the mount to the Garden of Gethsemane. After services at both locations, they would then march to the Holy Sepulchre for a dawn service. Though they followed a specific route, there was no attempt to trace Jesus' footsteps. It was merely an organized means to see several important sites in a single pass. This route naturally followed along the northern side of the Temple Mount, where the Antonia Fortress was. In the 8th century, the route had changed because both the city changed and the sites they wanted to visit changed. Instead of passing the Temple Mount to the north, they went along its southern side to the house of Caiaphas. The next stop was the Praetorium at the Church of Holy Wisdom, somewhere in the Tyropoeon Valley. This church is not known today. And finally, they moved on to the Holy Sepulchre. For those that don't know the Tyropoeon Valley, it splits the western and eastern hills, but was filled in as the city grew west from the city of David. By the 11th century, all public processions were outlawed by the Fatimids. In 1048, Emperor Constantine Monomachus restored the Holy Sepulchre and incorporated several small chapels, signifying the Passion narrative. This allowed Christians and pilgrims to commemorate the suffering of Jesus without having to go out onto the street. As a result, the memory of some of the locations waned. When the Crusaders took control in the 12th century, the processions started again. However, Crusader intolerance for the Eastern Church and their customs created tension and differing opinions about the route. In 1169, the German monk Theodoric visited Jerusalem and located Pilate's condemnation of Jesus on Mount Zion. Recent archaeological finds on Mount Zion, or better put, the Western Hill, have reinvigorated scholarly interest in this being the actual start of the Via Dolorosa. However, Pilate's house was considered to be near the Antonia Fortress by the Lion's Gate, and this is the location of Jesus' condemnation that won out. It wasn't until the 14th century that the Franciscan custodians of the Holy Land began to develop a circuit of holy places. The route started at the Holy Sepulchre and ended at the house of Pilate. In the 15th century, Christian leaders started to develop a sense that the section between the Holy Sepulchre and the house of Pilate should be given a status of its own, with important stops on the route itself. And with this, they determined that the route should go from the palace to the sepulchre rather than the other way around. By the 16th century, 3 stations had been identified. The first was Jesus' encounter with his mother. The second was Simon of Cyrene taking up the cross while Jesus addressed the women of Jerusalem. And the third commemorated Veronica wiping the face of Jesus. More stations were added over time, including one where Jesus falls, and another where some bystanders hit Jesus. At this time there were 7 stations, and they were referred to as the 7 Falls. All of this had tremendous impact on pilgrims, and some of them returned to Europe and instituted them into worship in their communities. In 1563, Jan van Passion wrote his spiritual pilgrimage of Jerusalem as a reflection on the path. This was the first time the term Way of the Cross was used. In Europe, the ritual started to take on a life of its own. Churches and communities began to set up small versions of the Way of the Cross to commemorate Jesus' triumphal march. As the ritual grew in popularity, more stations were added. Eventually, the number rose from 7 to 14 stations. As European pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem, what they knew to be the path back home clashed with what their Franciscan guides in Jerusalem were teaching. In order to avoid being shamed, the Franciscan monks took on the Western version of the Way of the Cross, with its 14 stations. Technically speaking, Christians began walking the sorrowful path almost immediately, but not as a custom to commemorate Jesus' triumphal march. The path was more of a means to get to the sites that they wanted to stop at to pray over Jesus' trial and sacrifice. The beginning of the Via Dolorosa is a cornucopia of confusion, so I'll try to keep everything straight here. The Via Dolorosa begins at Station 1, which is where Jesus was condemned to death. Tradition places this event at the Antonia Fortress, which sat on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. Today, the Omoria School sits on this location, as does the Chapel of the Condemnation and the Chapel of the Flagellation, which are in the courtyard across the street from the school. We have no archaeological evidence of where the Antonia Fortress actually stood because the old city is on top of any remains that could be underneath the streets and market. The only evidence that we have is from Josephus. If you follow the Franciscan procession on Friday afternoon, you will start from the Omorai school, but in the courtyard across the street are the two chapels. The first one is to the left when you enter the courtyard, and it is called the Chapel of Condemnation. It corresponds with Station 1 of the Via Dolorosa, where Jesus is condemned. Definitely visit the Chapel of Condemnation, and if you can't get into the Omorai school, start your journey on the sorrowful path here. Head back towards the entrance to the courtyard, and at the opposite end from the Chapel of Condemnation, you'll find the Chapel of the Flagellation. This is often associated with Station 2 of the Via Dolorosa, but the beating and mocking of Jesus is technically in between the condemnation of Christ and Christ picking up his cross. There are as many explanations for where Station 1 and Station 2 are as there are tour guides willing to give you their opinion, so don't get wrapped around the axle about where the real beginning is. In all actuality, whether you are standing in the courtyard of the Omorai school or the courtyard of the two chapels, you are on the location of the Antonia Fortress and its courtyard. For ease of movement and to reduce confusion, just follow the discs with the Roman numerals on them. When you enter the courtyard of the two chapels, the disc at the entrance has the Roman numeral 1 on it for Station 1, so you're at the beginning. The Via Dolorosa ends at Station 14, which is the tomb of Christ. It's not much of a tomb anymore, as the remnants sit under the edicule located under the larger dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Inside the edicule, you will find the slab of stone on which Jesus' body was laid after he was placed in the tomb. Station 1. Jesus is condemned to death. Mark 15, 6-20. As stated earlier, the courtyard inside the Omorai school is considered the traditional start of the Via Dolorosa. However, the Chapel of the Condemnation across the street is also within the perimeter which the Antonia Fortress and its courtyard are thought to have sat. The disc with the Roman numeral 1 on it marks the entrance to this courtyard. Upon entering, turn left and you'll find the Chapel of Condemnation. Turn right and you'll find the Chapel of Flagellation, which remembers the beating of Jesus by the Roman soldiers. If it's open when you are there, make sure to check it out, as I feel it is much more appealing inside than the Chapel of Condemnation. Exit the gate you enter the courtyard through and turn right. You will now be heading in a westerly direction. About 20 yards from the gate to Station 1, on the right-hand side, look up and you will find the disc for Station 2. Station 2. Jesus takes up his cross. John 19:17. In many pamphlets and books, Station 2 is linked with the Chapel of the Flagellation. This really doesn't make sense though, because Jesus took up his cross after being condemned to death and beaten. Out on the street on the back side of the Chapel of Condemnation is a second marker, a disc with the Roman numeral 2 on it. This is Station 2. It corresponds with the action of Jesus taking up his cross. Once you are done, continue heading west. The Via Dolorosa Street will run into a T intersection at Al-Wad Street. Turn left and head south on Al-Wad Street. Station 3 will be on your left almost immediately after you turn. Station 3. Jesus falls for the first time. Station 3 is one of the stations that have no biblical justification. It was added as a tradition over time, most likely in one of the iterations developed in Europe. But that doesn't mean it isn't significant. In all the Gospels, we get the sense that the procession took a toll on Jesus, which eventually leads to the Roman soldiers enlisting the help of Simon of Cyrene. Station 3 is located on the corner of the Via Dolorosa Street and Al-Wad Street. You'll know that you have found it because there is an Israeli security detail on the corner. Right next to the security detail is Station 3. There is a small chapel inside that you can visit if it is open. I'm not sure of the hours, as every time I passed by it was closed. Don't wander off though, because Station 4 is right next to you. Station 4. Jesus meets his mother, who collapses in shock, the spasm. Like Station 3, Station 4 has no biblical justification, but its significance is still felt. Mary, the mother of Jesus, represents humanity, and her feminine compassion for the pain Jesus endured represents the collective sorrow of the human race for the crucifixion. You will find Station 4 right next to Station 3. Inside the entrance is a restaurant. The Church of Our Lady of Sorrows is inside next to the restaurant. But like Station 3, every time I walked by, it was closed. Once you are finished, continue heading south on Alwad Street. About 20 yards down, you'll find Station 5. Station 5. Simon of Cyrene helps Jesus. Mark 15:21. Station 5 is probably the most recognizable of all the stations. It sits right at the intersection of Alwad Street and where the Via Dolorosa Street picks up again. This station commemorates the act of Simon of Cyrene helping Jesus carry his cross. There is a chapel at the location as well, but the times are hit or miss. Next to the chapel entrance is a stone that tradition says Jesus laid his hand on to keep from falling down. We already know that the Via Dolorosa we walk today is not accurate, so it's safe to say that this stone is more of a tradition rather than a fact, but that doesn't make it irrelevant. Tradition plays a huge role in honoring historical events. Just because someone at some point added some flavor to an event, such as this one, does not preclude that event from being legitimate. Jesus was tired from the beating he received and from carrying the cross. He no doubt stumbled and touched things along the way to stay standing. Even if this rock is not the true rock, it tells a story about Jesus' journey that is important. From the Alwad Street intersection, turn right to head up the Via Dolorosa Street. You are now heading west again. Station 6. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. About 50 or 60 yards up from Station 5 on the Via Dolorosa Street, Station 6 marks a tradition that is not referenced in the Bible, at least not in the Crucifixion narrative. There is no reference to a Veronica in the biblical narrative at all. However, there is talk of her in some of the apocryphal texts, namely the Gospel of Nicodemus, which was written by Eusebius of Caesarea in the early 4th century. As the story goes, seeing Jesus suffering, Veronica felt compassion and offered her veil so he could wipe his face. When he handed her the veil back, his face was imprinted on it. Because Veronica is not mentioned in the biblical text, Eusebius and other extra-biblical texts connect her with the woman who suffered from constant bleeding. This story is found in Matthew 9:20-22, Mark 5:25-34, and Luke 8:43-48. Station 6 is an easy station to miss, so don't look for the wooden door that marks the chapel, but rather the baby blue door next to it. Both are on the left side of the pathway if you are heading west towards the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Look up and you'll see the disc with the Roman numeral 6 on it. Tradition states that this is the location where the home of Veronica stood. The chapel at Station 6 is much like many of the others. Its hours are difficult to pin down. Continue heading west up the Via Dolorosa Street as it inclines. Station 7. Jesus falls for the second time. Again, this is not referenced in the Bible. Station 7 is about 50 yards up from Station 6, where the Via Dolorosa Street intersects with XIII Street at a T intersection. The chapel at Station 7 commemorates Jesus falling. From Station 7, there is a pathway immediately to the left if you're looking at the chapel that shoots off from XIII Street. This is Ma'alat Ikonka Street. Head up this path about 20 yards and you will find Station 8 on the wall on the left. Station 8. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. Luke 23:27-31. Luke notes that a group of women followed Jesus, mourning and weeping. At some point along the way, he stopped and addressed them. Only Luke talks about this incident. Station 8 is one of only 2 stations to not have a chapel. In the wall at the station is a stone with a Latin cross chiseled out in the middle, and the Roman letters IC and XC on top and NIKA on the bottom. The letters on top are shorthand for Isos Christos, which are Roman representations of the Greek words Isos Christos, while Nika is the Roman representation of the Greek word Niki. Together these words mean Jesus Christ and victory, so the phrase being said is Jesus Christ conquers. And if we think back to the discussion on Mark's description of Jesus' march from his condemnation to Golgotha being a triumphal march, we can further see that European Christians most likely did understand Mark's narrative through the lens of the Roman triumph, with all of its themes of victory and heroic conquerors. This wall is on the backside of the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. Charalambos. Head back down Kaunas side street, turn right, and head south away from Station 7. The staircase that leads up to Station 9 is tricky to find. Look for a juice stand. Behind it is the staircase. Once you are on that path, just follow it as it only leads to one place. Station 9. Jesus falls for the third time. Like the other falls, Station 9 has no biblical reference. It is also the other station to not have a dedicated chapel. If your group was carrying a wooden cross, this is where you will drop it off at. Continue down the path and there will be 3 doors. One straight ahead, one to the right, and one to the left. Go left. You will enter an open courtyard that is on top of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The small dome in the middle is the dome for the Chapel of St. Helena inside the church. There is an area that looks like small apartments. This is where the Ethiopian monks live. In the southwest corner of the courtyard, an open door will lead you down a dark staircase through the Ethiopian chapels. There's only one way to go, so just follow the path. You will exit into the courtyard in front of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Do not enter the church yet though. Go up the staircase next to the entrance. Station 10. Jesus is stripped of his garments. Mark 15:24. The Chapel of the Franks honors the moment that Jesus was stripped of his garments. The soldiers refrained from tearing the garments off so that they could cast lots for them. When you get to the top of the stairs, you will have to fight the reflection in the window to see inside. You cannot get into the chapel though. When you get inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is another window next to Station 11 that looks down on the Chapel of the Franks. However, your best view will be from the outside at the top of these stairs. After you're done, head to the entrance of the church and take an immediate right turn. You will find a steep staircase. Climb up it to find Station 11. Station 11. Jesus is nailed to the cross. Mark 15:24. This upstairs area has 2 stations and half of a 3rd station. Station 11 is the chapel of the nailing to the cross, and it remembers Jesus being placed on the cross and nailed to it. The area can sometimes get crowded, especially at midday. You have to get in line for Station 12, so don't get pushy or impatient. Station 12. Jesus dies on the cross. Mark 15:37. The chapel of the Crucifixion is where Jesus died on the cross. Under the glass box is the rock that the cross was driven into. What you will get in line for is the chance to kneel down and crawl into the little vestibule in the middle, where you can put your hand into the hole in the floor and feel the rock. Historically speaking, there is good reason to believe that this was in fact the stone that the cross was placed into. As discussed earlier, Hadrian built the temple to Venus on this spot, and early Christians knew it was the spot where the crucifixion happened. When Constantine had the temple demolished, a tomb and quarry were found underneath it, just as the Jerusalem Christians had said. In between stations 11 and 12 is the altar of the Lady of Sorrow. Some guides will say that this is Station 13. Others will say it's the stone of unction at the bottom of the stairs. As you exit the area from Station 12, there is a different staircase to go down. When you get to the bottom, take a left and you will find Station 13. Station 13. Jesus is taken down from the cross. Mark 15:46. The stone of unction, also known as the stone of anointing, is considered to be the slab of stone that Jesus was laid upon when his body was removed from the cross before being transferred to the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Unfortunately, the stone only dates back to the early 1800s AD, when it was placed in the church after some repairs. But like the Via Dolorosa itself, it has a traditional meaning to it, and it represents a part of a journey which Jesus took to the tomb. If we think about everything we've seen on the Via Dolorosa so far, some things have biblical backing and some don't. It might be disheartening to hear that a religious tradition doesn't have the history that we think it does, but we need to think about what it is. Does the stone of unction matter, in the grand scheme of things? I would argue that it does not. Of all the stations on the Via Dolorosa, the ones that matter the most are the Rock of Golgotha and the Tomb of Christ. As we've discussed, there is good reason to believe that both of these stations are legit. Both locations were known to the early Christians in the 1st century, and when Hadrian built the Temple of Venus, it marked the spot for over 200 years. After the temple was removed, the rock and the tomb were found. They were then preserved and set apart, but compared to Christ's sacrifice, both of these things are meaningless as well. They're just organic props in a larger story. These objects and locations have stories of their own, but we aren't visiting the Holy Land for the sake of the Holy Land. We're visiting because we want to connect with Christ on an organic level. And the surprising thing is that there is a plethora of locations and objects in the Holy Land that bring all the Bible stories that we know to life visually and organically. A visit to the Holy Land can give us organic touch points to the biblical narrative, and that can be tremendously reassuring. But even more important is that these touch points bring us closer to the God through physical experience in the land that he interacted with his people. When you visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you will find many people kneeling and praying over the stone of unction. It is customary to kiss the stone or rub it with rosewater or oil and then wipe the stone clean on that spot with a cloth. It is said that the stone's anointing transfers to the cloth and therefore the cloth now has healing power. If you want to partake in the tradition, I don't see any reason not to. Traditions can be fun, and despite its history, can still be a form of worship. Personally, I like to place prayer notes between the stones in the western wall. The question I'd ask yourself is, if Jesus is truly in your heart, do you need his power to be in an object for you to feel his presence or blessing? Station 14. Jesus is laid in the tomb. Mark 15:46. The edicule is station 14. It's hard to look at the large boxy structure and think of it as a tomb though, but it is, or rather was. When the tomb was found in the 4th century, the hill around it was dug out and it was enclosed by the edicule. Over the last 2,000 years, things have changed drastically, and the edicule evolved into what it is today. Imagine the area around the edicule being dirt and rock. Inside is the slab of stone that was part of the tomb in which Jesus was laid. It's had a rough go over the years as early pilgrims chipped away pieces to take with them. There are a few times when visiting the edicule is easiest. First thing in the morning when the church opens is the best time to visit on any day. So if you are an early riser and your tour group doesn't start until 7 or 8, head down to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre around 5 or 5:30 a.m., and you will probably have free reign. Groups start to meander in around 6:30 a.m. Tuesdays are the slowest tourist days, and Sundays, particularly around lunchtime, are downright awful. The Via Dolorosa is not accurate because the landscape of the modern Old City of Jerusalem is not the same as it was in the 1st century. As noted earlier, by the 12th century, the landscape had changed so much that memory of some of the original processional sites was lost. Today, the street that the Via Dolorosa follows did not exist in the 1st century. As far as the accuracy of the stations, only 9 of the stations can legitimately be linked to the biblical narrative. The others are either customs that developed in Europe, or in the case of Veronica, are taken from another narrative in the Gospels. With that being said, the Via Dolorosa's purpose is to pay homage to Christ's sacrifice on the cross. It doesn't need to be physically accurate. It's a form of worship directed towards Jesus, and that is all we need. For those that question Christianity for arguments about historicity, the fact that the Via Dolorosa has a history is telling. Arguments over locations in which archaeology and facts can point to things that are referenced in the biblical narrative say more about legitimacy than one may think. Disagreements about artifacts, archaeological finds, and writings that relate to the biblical narrative tell us that something happened here. And it happened at a time in which the Bible says that it happened. But it's a 10,000-piece puzzle, and we only have 1,000 pieces. The Passion narrative is also incredibly complex. Far too complex in my mind to be conjured up. If we look at ancient religions and stories like the Roman and Greek gods, the Enuma Elish, or modern tales such as those we find in our own superhero lore, it's readily apparent that human creativity does not have the capacity to create a story with the scope and depth that we find in the Bible. After the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948, a surge of archaeological digging uncovered a large portion of the wall on the western part of the Old City. What appears to be a small side gate can be seen about 500 yards south of Jaffa Gate. The gate has been filled in by stone, but remnants reveal something peculiar. Excavations in the citadel next to Jaffa Gate have revealed a large compound determined to be the place where Herod lived. In essence, a palace. This side gate would have been at the southern end of the compound. The side gate appears to be less of a spot for traffic to enter and exit the city. Rather, it appears to be a possible location where Herod and later Pilate conducted trials. The main entrance to the palace was on the inside of the security walls, where space would have been tight and lacking the room needed to address large crowds. It does not make sense that criminals would be taken into the palace for trial through the main entrance. The same would be true for commoners seeking an appeal from Herod or Pilate. But it does make sense that a gate structure on the outside of the city would be used solely for this purpose. The side gate also allows for massive crowds to gather around to hear from the leader or watch a trial, something that would most likely be prohibited from inside the palace. Traditionally, the Antonia Fortress has been thought to be Pilate's residence while he was in town. But this does not make sense because a Roman official would not stay with the grunts in the barracks. This side gate theory matches the claim by Theodoric in the 12th century that Pilate's condemnation of Jesus happened on Mount Zion. If this is the case, then the real Via Dolorosa started at this gate and headed north, straight to Golgotha. I would even add that the large crowd mentioned in Mark would have been facilitated more easily on this route than through the city. The Bible doesn't tell us what happened to the cross after the crucifixion. However, there is a tradition that has been passed down since the time of Constantine. As the story goes, when Constantine's mother, Helena, went to Jerusalem at his request to find the tomb of Christ, she also found the remains of a wooden cross on the ground near the temple. She assumed that these remains were from the cross Jesus was crucified on. Today, a few small relics of the true cross exist. However, carbon dating sets them in the 11th century, vice the 4th century, or even the 1st century. Thanks for watching, and if you like the content in today's video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to keep me in your feed. If you want to read more content, check out my website at holylandtravelhq.com.